Good afternoon. We are live, it appears. Thank you to everyone tuning in to join us in this Daily Maverick webinar. And thanks most of all to my co-conspirator here, Imraan Coovadia, one of South Africa's best known and most respected literary scholars, novelists, non-fiction writers, really a bit of a renaissance man, Mr. Coovadia. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think I just had too much time on my hands.
I appreciate you giving a little bit of it to us. Daily Maverick listeners and readers joining us, please do be aware that at any point you can order Imraan's books that we are discussing here today, which is The Poisoners, via the Daily Maverick website. I think there will be a link to that effect placed in the chat box. So please do use it and support both Imraan and Daily Maverick. Right, so as I mentioned, we are here to discuss Imraan's recently published book, The Poisoners on South Africa's Toxic Past, which I must say is an absolutely fascinating survey of an absolutely fascinating topic. Imraan, I don't think there's many people in the world who would say they are uninterested in poison, but how did you, what piqued your interest in particular in this topic?
Well, actually, you've hit it right there. You know, I'm a kind of, I forget who said this to me about my writing fiction. They said, you know, maybe you should choose a topic that people are interested in. So I thought, you know, as a storyteller, maybe it's best to choose things that people like to tell stories about. And poisoning, it turns out, is something that people have been telling stories about for thousands of years, and it occupies a certain place in our imagination. I guess like murder, it has a certain, you know, it just has a certain inherent fascination for us. And I think some of that is just physical, you know, the fear of taking in something to our body that harms us. And some of it is the kind of aspect of intrigue, that someone can poison you without you ever knowing about the fact that you've been poisoned.
That's right. And the distance aspect, which you mentioned in your book at length as well, which is also a terrifying aspect. And we'll get into all those particular features of poison, I think, as we go along. You mentioned to me just off camera that the book was completed a while ago and that you actually had no idea that it would continue to have so much currency in the current news cycle.
It's fascinating. You know, I didn't even know that when I started writing this book, I mean, I started writing it into pieces. I became interested first in this class of Rhodesians who had been involved in poisoning in the Bush War in the late 1970s. And I had no idea that the story stretched all the way up to the present day. And when I realized that it was actually central to Jacob Zuma's defense of himself in court, I guess I was delighted is the wrong word, but fascinated. The question of those medical reports, like, do they show that he was poisoned or not? And is that an excuse to stay away from court or to get out of jail? I mean, they've been central in the last year and a half, but it's a surprise to me that the story has continued in that way. I mean, I have some ideas about why that is. I think that there's a certain kind of storytelling that Jacob Zuma is a master of, that poisoning falls in very well with. But yes, it continues to be a current issue.
I mean, you're right there. It's almost no exaggeration to say that some of our current political intrigue is really hinging on the question of poisoning and who's been poisoned and who hasn't. We also saw the recent absence from our political life of the Deputy President, Didi Mabuza, for several months, allegedly as a result of poisoning. So this isn't actually in South Africa a kind of niche or hobbyist matter. It is something very fundamental to our politics. And I wanted to ask you, you do mention this a bit in the book, to what degree is Southern Africa preoccupied with poisoning to a degree that is unmatched in the rest of the world?
It's a very good question, and I'm just not knowledgeable enough to say. I did some reading, and I suspect that if you poke around, I mean, people have poked around in CIA files, for example, and the CIA actually did use poison, and you know, obviously the Russians use poison, you know, and continue to use poison. And there are different traditions of popular poisoning around the world. The problem is all of that real use of poison is overlaid by a kind of a web of rumors and stories and suspicions. For example, during the British occupation of India, which lasted, 300 years, there was a sense that Indians were particularly preoccupied with using poisons against British people. Although, there are very few cases. There's a sense in the 19th century that Victorian women, middle-class women, were very likely to use poison against their husbands. And while there are a few cases, it's disproportionately exaggerated compared to the overall use of poisoning. So on the one hand, there's the substantial use of poison, and there's definitely substantive uses of poison in Southern Africa. On the other hand, there's the kind of imaginary weight it places on us, and that differs from place to place. I don't know if we're very special in this way, but it certainly seems to be part of who we are and what we do.
So like you, Imraan, I was fascinated to learn about the history of poisoning in pre-independence Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia, and in the manner in which it was bound up with the Selous Scouts and that whole kind of boys' own brigade. And partly I'm interested because, as you say, there has been this association of poisoning with women to some degree. So it seemed, it was intriguing to me that the Selous Scouts, which this band of, as you say, boys' own adventurers, these kind of macho gung-ho guys, would actually take such an interest in poison. Can you just tell us a bit about the Rhodesian poisoning situation, and also how on earth you even stumbled onto that in the first place?
It's a very good question. Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know how I stumbled onto in this case, Bob Symington. He seems to have had many skills and to have been employed as, Paratheon is a bit one I'm particularly interested in, and turn them into poisons. Because they had no real hope of winning a direct war, so that they thought, maybe poisons are the way to do this. I was staggered at the scale of it. I mean, look, there's been some reporting on this, in particular by an American security agent of some kind called Glenn Cross, who wrote a book on the Rhodesian dirty war. But the connections between the Rhodesians and the South Africans surprised me, and the sheer ruthlessness of the Rhodesian program is really quite staggering. The use, the injection of poisons into tinned medicines, for example, is one of my, again, favorites is the wrong word, but it's very effective, because if someone feels sick, they turn to medicine, and then the medicine kills them. The other thing was the example of poisoned clothes. Many civilians got these poisoned clothes, and then they would go to hospital, be treated. Some of them got better. They put on the poisoned clothes again, get poisoned again.
It was astonishing to me that poison can be used so effectively on clothes. I mean, I'd heard about the Reverend Frank Chikane, who was a victim of that during apartheid. But I mean, can you explain? I know you're not a scientist as such. Can you explain how the brushing of poison onto clothes actually works?
You're right. I mean, firstly, it's worrying that I've become the number one, as far as I can tell, I'm the number one expert on chemical and biological weapons in Southern Africa. Absolutely no training. So that I think should worry us about our region. Look, Paratheon is a very, very, very deadly poison. It's part of a whole series of poisons that were invented by, of all people, the Nazis. Between 1939 and 1945, they devised a number of very extremely frightening poisons. Paratheon is so deadly that when you introduce it to a country as an agricultural chemical, as in Sri Lanka, it massively increases the suicide rate, because every time someone thinks of killing themselves, they basically can kill themselves. So it's a very, very virulent poison, and if you put it in fabric, it'll soak out, and in very small amounts it will harm your body. And even though I assume even if the clothes are washed a number of times.
I'm amused by you saying that it is in some way, I don't know, unfitting for you to be the primary expert on this. You cite at one stage doctors as saying that Agatha Christie, the British murder mystery writer, of course, she still seems to be a preeminent expert when it comes to the symptoms of thallium poisoning.
No,
right.
No.
So you certainly would not be the first fiction writer to take on that mantle.
That is true. And in fact, after your review appeared in the Maverick, someone wrote to me and they said that a member of their family they thought had been poisoned by thallium, and could I help? And I said, well, but what was interesting was the first thallium poisoning case in South Africa was, I discussed it in the book, was probably a security branch poisoning, and it was the first time anyone had ever used thallium, and various people at the UCT medical school, Krutiskeer, actually looked at it and said, what, this person seems to have thallium poisoning. How do we know it? Because we've read Agatha Christie novels. So,
right. I love that as a Christie fan myself. I'm so curious to know what you replied to your correspondent.
I mean, I just, I pointed her in the direction of sources, I think.
How wonderful to become somebody to whom all poisoning will now be referred. You mentioned Robert Symington, this character in Rhodesia, I was so struck, and I mentioned this in my review, by these extraordinary characters that popped up in Southern Africa to do with this poisoning industry. I mean, is it a chicken egg situation? Is it the nature of poison that attracts these bizarre characters, or what's going on there?
That's a very good question. My somewhat speculative guesses. You remember all the strange people who crawled out of the woodwork during President Trump's administration, or all the extremely peculiar set of gangsters who appeared around Jacob Zuma, particularly towards the end of his term in office. Not just Kenny Kunene, but a whole string of other people. I think that certain kinds of ethnic mobilization and whether it's white supremacy, black, whatever it is, certain kinds of ethnic mobilization bring out certain kinds of personalities, and I think that's why this, and also they empower them so that, Symington could pursue his poison experiments at length. In any normal country, he'd have been sent to prison. Of course, he was eventually given the chair of the anatomy department at UCT. And, I listened, again, a lot of the information in this book is very critical of the court system and the university system. And I'm very supportive of both of those things. But I do think neither of those systems have taken on their role in any of these events, and many other events by implication, nuclear research, military research, and so forth.
You're based at UCT, obviously. I mean, to what degree is there any sign that UCT is reckoning with Robert Symington as a historical figure? Absolutely nothing. The only thing that happened was I talked to the Anatomy Association of Southern Africa. That they have this prize. I found they have the Bob Symington Prize, for a promising junior researcher. And they admitted no guilt, but at some point they seem to have either renamed the prize or taken down their website. I'm not entirely sure. But, until last year, anyway, they were very happily giving a prize in the name of a very notorious poisoner, someone who is responsible for many thousands of illegal deaths. As for UCT's dealing with its history, I think this is part of my difference with the kind of decolonial movement and stuff. I feel like they bother about who's reading which poem rather than which serious crimes were committed. And for me, it's a massive loss of perspective in terms of what actually matters. But it's just my prejudice. That's interesting. So back to these characters. Symington is there in Rhodesia, and he's being assisted by, I think, my personal favorite, which was the Minister of Defense, PK van der Bijl. Could you sketch, perhaps, for our listeners a bit about that character?
He was born in Cape Town, and he as I say in the book, he always wanted to play Tarzan. Apparently he's very handsome. I mean, what do I know? I see his photograph. Apparently he's a very handsome man. But he ended up in Rhodesia, rather, running, kind of in charge of their secret war, and he was the person who licensed these poisoning operations with Symington. He also married this princess with a very long name from, Schleswig-Holstein or Austria or something. And
Liechtenstein, yeah.
Liechtenstein. I guess if you're going to marry a princess, probably Liechtensteini princesses are the easiest to access. And I actually should have followed up on what happened to him. He died, but I assume he has descendants. I assume that the Van der Bijls are ruling somewhere, but I don't know where exactly.
I was going to ask you the same thing. These strange Liechtensteinian royals must be somewhere. So you point out as well that these men were kind of interconnected in strange ways that aren't always clear still. Symington, Van der Bijl ran their own little poisoning operation. Symington then moved to South Africa and certainly became associated. I love that word that we journalists use, a known associate of. He was a known associate of Wouter Basson, although it's not totally clear how. I mean, is it your impression that there was any kind of formal networks between these people, or was it more sub rosa, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, between Symington and Basson, there was with some technical knowledge. I mean, in my opinion, none of them were geniuses. People think Basson was a genius. He doesn't seem like a genius to me. But there were a network of men with a fair amount of technical knowledge in Rhodesia, South Africa, also in Angola and Mozambique, and they collaborated in these different ways in creating these weapons and using them.
I mean, this is the question that kind of was on my mind throughout it, which is sort of, what is it about a race war and poison? I mean, how do those two things link in your mind? I think it's an extremely deep question. Look, I don't think it's just poison. I think there are also ways of storytelling when you have race wars, storytelling that brings each race together and divides it from other races or religious groups or, whatever it is. I think poisoning is a very
it's a mark of real indifference towards other people to use it on a large scale, at least for the relations. Well, I think there's a distinction here. For relation between white and black, for the Rhodesians, for the white Rhodesians, it was just kind of, we have a bunch of agricultural chemicals here. Let's use them on black people. There are too many black people that, this is a very cheap way of getting rid of them. For internal black politics, it's different, because the question then for Zuma, Mnangagwa, Mugabe, the problem was always, here are our friends, but how do we really know that we're our friends? Here we are sharing a meal with them. What if they put something into the grape juice? So in a way, I think in white supremacist politics, poisoning was kind of about just using the most economically appropriate means or politically appropriate means. In black politics, it became an issue of intimacy. Who do we know that's close to us who might be about to betray us?
Yeah, I think that you're right in terms of, there's a certain indiscriminacy in the way that poison was used, particularly in Rhodesia, right? By definition, civilians were being targeted, and of course with Basson as well. So there is also the aspect where you clearly are not focused necessarily on who you're killing, and that is an aspect which I suppose was a feature of these wars in general, not necessarily poisoning. Imraan, another character who really fascinated me in your book was Stephen J. Hatfill. Really almost mind-blowing that this character who turns up in at least two more, really, incidents, sort of geopolitical moments of crisis. There's this guy, he's like the Forrest Gump of poison, Stephen J. Hatfill, and he's in Rhodesia, he's in America around 9/11. Talk us through him a little bit.
Well, Stephen J. Hatfill became world famous because when the anthrax murders happened in the US, September 11 happened, and everyone was really terrified that Osama bin Laden had thousands of hidden Muslims about to carry out further terrorist attacks, which they weren't, as it turned out. But immediately in the aftermath of that were these anthrax attacks, kind of letters going out through the mail with anthrax spores, and a few people died, not that many. But the person that became of real interest to the FBI was a guy who had been in Rhodesia during the major anthrax outbreak there in 78, 79, which, if it was a human-directed outbreak, would have been, in all likelihood, directed by Symington. And so Hatfill seemed to be the connection between the artificial use of anthrax in Rhodesia and the sudden outbreak of anthrax in the United States. He was also someone who was trained in South Africa. UCT loved him. They opened their arms to Hatfill. Stellenbosch also loved him, and he even signed up for a PhD at Rhodes. So he was kind of an American in Africa for adventure, and he found adventure in his different ways. He got to inject things into security guards in Cape Town. He got to be part of South Africa's Antarctic adventure, and he even wrote Antarctic mission, and he was the doctor in charge of that mission, and he even wrote a novel about his experiences as from the Antarctic. So fascinating, weird, highly unlikable character. He also happened to be 600, his office in the United States happened to be 600 feet, 300 meters away from the anthrax flask that was the apparent origin of those terrorist attacks.
Until I read that, I'd forgotten what a big deal anthrax used to be. There was that real moment where anthrax was, the fear. And I suppose the same people who are obsessed with Wuhan labs and all that would have jumped right on the anthrax attacks at the moment. If you joined us late, thank you so much for joining us. We are discussing Imraan Coovadia's fascinating new book, The Poisoners. And please do feel free to drop any questions you have into the chat. Liakota Lipoko saying, mind-blowing. I agree. It is mind-blowing. Talk us through a bit through where you obtained much of this mind-blowing information. I also want to say, Imraan, at the beginning of the book, you said that you think that this is the kind of research that actually should have been carried out by, a proper journalist or a historian.
Responsible journalist like yourself.
I couldn't tell if that was a kind of preemptive defense of yourself or if it's a genuine critique of the rest of us for not doing this.
No, it's not a critique. I just wondered, why are there all these, as your listener said, why are there this mind-blowing material, which I think is really relevant to us and important for us. Why is someone as irresponsible as me being allowed to look at it? I feel like really responsible people should be looking at it.
I think your handling of it is perfectly responsible, let the record show.
Unfortunately. But I do feel like there's a whole group of people out there who would really understand this, and they must be those people. On the other hand, adulthood is slowly a process of realizing that there aren't those people. So you always think that there's some group of responsible people who run the world and understand stuff, and then once you get old enough, you realize there were never those people.
That's exactly what I say about journalism. As soon as you realize how the sausage is made, so to speak, politically, you lose all faith in humankind. We're still in Zimbabwe at the moment because it turned out that the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe independence, which took place, when was Zimbabwe independence?
79, 80.
Yeah, that in no way put an end to the poisoning. And in fact, there's some suggestion in your book that post-colonial societies are big poison hubs in general for a variety of interesting reasons. Michael Swango, another of these characters, Michael Swango, this American doctor, comes to Zimbabwe and poisons around 100 patients in the US and Zimbabwe. And I must say that I absolutely agree with you, Imraan, that I was reading this and thinking, how is this man not a kind of household name? How is he not our version of, a Jack Kevorkian or a Wouter Basson, who is a household name, I suppose? Yeah.
I don't know. Although, Jack Kevorkian I have a little more sympathy for. But yes, Swango, I don't know. He'd obviously had this background of poisoning patients in the United States, and then he was about to get arrested, and he moves to, of all places, Zimbabwe, and sets himself up in a hospital, in a mission hospital in Zimbabwe, and he tells everybody, "Look, I'm here because I love Africa. I just love being in the bush. I'm very comfortable with Black people, and." He presents himself as a humanitarian. And I think one of the most interesting sort of dark comic aspects of this material is Swango and later Wouter Basson present themselves as people who really loved Black people and just wanted the best for them, And so Swango wanted the best for Black people in this hospital. And of course, pretty much, the first evening he gets a chance, he starts injecting his patients. And, I tracked down some reports of those patients years later, and, many of them are dead. Some of them have terrible injuries of different kinds, and still remember this terrible episode. I also found an Iranian doctor who'd worked in that hospital, but for some reason, after telling him about my thoughts about the situation, he refused to talk to me, which is something that happened in many cases. People would just refuse to talk.
That's fascinating. Out of fear, do you think?
Look, some of them were implicated in some of these crimes. So, there are all I can say is there are a lot of vets in Australia. The next time you're in Australia and you take your puppy to be fixed or whatever it is, there are a terrifying number of vets in Australia who spent their early 20s poisoning people in Southern Africa. And, doctors in Toronto and, but they don't talk.
Yeah, that was also one of the things that came through so clearly from your book is the number of how Africa's been used as an absolute playground by these chances, these absolute frickin' chances, these Americans and Europeans who come here and just run wild, really. And there's absolutely no accountability. And, it's kind of like the Happy Valley set in Kenya, but with poison.
I guess if I was still a very serious literary scholar, I would say Heart of Darkness. But the Guptas were a very similar case. They come to Africa, they figure there's no controls here. Let's run wild. Let's do whatever we want.
Thank goodness for our investigative media, Imraan.
Absolutely.
Because that's all that's holding us from the darkness. I wanted to quote this description of a poisoner from your book, which I found so interesting, and that's according to criminologists. And this isn't something that you get into a lot, I must say, the kind of criminal profile of a poisoner, because you have more interesting things to look at. But there are common features of criminal poisoning. He or she is given to daydreaming, rejects the idea that life has a moral foundation, and is likely to be familiar with medical materials as a doctor, nurse, chemist or pharmacist, dentist or laboratory technician. That really makes sense. The idea that you have to have some kind of proximity to materials, but I was so interested by the given to daydreaming. Is it really the case that when we sort of drift off into a fugue state, we're all going to poison?
Yes. No. I think when you start daydreaming too much, you need to get it fixed. Yeah. Because you don't know where it will lead. No. Look, I look, I'm a little skeptical about the psychological profile question in this case, because most, these were people who are members of the military or paramilitary, not Swango so much. Swango fits that description a lot more closely. So I guess they're freelance poisoners, and they, let's face it, there's got to be something a little strange about you if you're in a freelance way killing people by poisoning them. And then there are military poisoners, or paramilitary poisoners, and they obey a different logic.
Yeah, although you could argue that the likes of Wouter Basson, for instance, I mean, Basson very much marched to his own drum, so to speak, right? It wasn't as if he was under instructions to pursue his most kind of outlandish plans. I should say we must be very careful discussing Wouter Basson, Imraan. And I'm not sure if you're aware what a vast fan club that man still has. But even after writing on your book, I received irate emails about the slander of the great Dr. Wouter Basson.
I have a student in my writing program who tells me that Basson is a hero to many young Afrikaners, and they see him as a genius and someone who was simply a very capable soldier.
Right, and that also he has never, ever been found guilty of anything. So we must use the word alleged very...
Okay. Wouter Basson, I tell you one interesting thing about living in South Africa is Wouter Basson is allegedly very charming, just like Jacob Zuma is allegedly very charming. And so, when you're trying to understand these people, you realize that there's stories that leave me really cold or that seem wildly implausible. When people hear them from Jacob Zuma or from Wouter Basson, they're amazed by them. One of my favorite moments in this book is when a man who has trusted Wouter Basson, alleged Wouter Basson. He's trusted Wouter Basson, and he hears on the radio that someone called Wouter Basson has been implicated in many grave crimes, I think in 1992. So he drives to Wouter's house. He says, Wouter, my friend, how can you have done this? And Wouter Basson says, allegedly, he says, you know what? There are many Wouter Bassons in the army. Don't worry.
Right.
And I thought, yeah, and I also have a bridge somewhere to sell you. But I guess I don't, because I don't feel the great charm of Wouter Basson or Jacob Zuma. I'm always a bit staggered by these stories, but apparently it exists.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I sort of understand it a bit from Zuma. Every time I saw him in person at a political rally, I did always find him likable. And then, of course, there was Helen Zille's great love letter to Jacob Zuma.
Of course, there was. Yeah.
If even the ice lady, Helen Zille, could be charmed, then I think we have to understand we're dealing with a kind of nuclear grade charisma here.
It's true.
Wouter Basson, yes. Something you didn't get into, but I'm curious to hear your view on this, is Wouter Basson was creating kind of, what do you call them? Class A recreational drugs, right? Ecstasy, Mandrax, etc. The idea that these were pumped into the Cape Flats, for instance, very deliberately. You do mention that, part of the purpose of this was for crowd control, was in order to make the kind of restless natives less restless, etc., etc. Did you come across in your research evidence for the idea that the Cape Flats' current drug problems was kind of pretty much, not organic, deliberately fermented to some degree by the likes of Basson?
I didn't, and I guess I wasn't looking for it. I know that those loads, I assume ecstasy, Basson, like me, Basson allegedly was behind the production. I'm not even sure it's alleged. I mean, I think this is on the table. Certainly Project Coast was behind the production of tons and tons of ecstasy. I don't know how much of it made it to the flats, and my sense is, and really I'm even more of an amateur in this case. My sense is ecstasy is not an addictive drug, so it wouldn't be behind it. Look, we've had numerous cases of state structures, policemen selling guns back to criminals, so we know the indifference with which people behave, in terms of drugs and guns and so forth. Yeah,
that's right. And to my correspondents who point out that Basson was never found guilty of anything. It's worth noting, as Imraan's book does at length, that he was in fact only tried for fraud, right, for his financial improprieties. And your account of that court case, which I really had never considered in any detail, is just mind-blowing. As you say, the kind of like openly racist shibboleths that are allowed to be aired in open court there.
It's very, I mean, yes, I mean, I think we both found that moment when, what is it, one of the lawyers argues that, Black people enter a state of catatonia. They're just different to us, to white people. I mean, this is what it was 1997, 1998. It's quite a statement to allow an open court. So, yes, and you know, the experience of reading those transcripts and reconstructing how that court went and the day-by-day decisions of the judge was really one of the most interesting puzzles I've ever tried to put together. Firstly, because I have no expertise, but secondly, because the decisions the judge were making was so out of bounds. You know, I mean, I think many people had the sense that something was going wrong in the court case, but the actual details of what happened, I think, are absolutely fascinating. And
it was actually 2001. I mean, that is frighteningly proximate historically.
Yes. Yeah, and a very clever judge, you know, who made all kinds of decisions, which really someone needs to account for. I mean, you know, we know that investigating the past doesn't happen very often in South Africa, but I would like to, you know, I'd like that judge to answer some questions about what he did. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a chapter on AIDS in this book, on in particular the kind of quackish cures peddled by those, again, just a stream of terrible chances who arrived in this country, the Matthias Rats, I've forgotten some of their names. To explain that decision to put those aspects into a book, because we're not talking about poison per se in the same sense as, you know, thallium and anthrax and the rest of it.
Yeah, it's not political poisoning. It's more an atmosphere of distrust in which things get labeled as poisons, which aren't poisons, and things which are poisonous are used as medicines. Look, when I was doing the research for this, I was amazed to find that in the middle of the early framework of AIDS denial, which is being set up in the 80s, is a South African who's living in New York, a psychoanalyst. You know, he's forgotten now, but in fact, there's a play about him. And he was he kind of moved to New York from Pretoria. He was kind of gay poet, and he wrote, as far as I can tell, the first kind of postmodern critique of the viral theory of transmission of AIDS. And people who study AIDS, the history of AIDS denial, seem to give that a lot of weight. So I found it fascinating that a South African would be behind that. And I started asking that question. And then I started looking at the early history of what happened. How did the bizarre conduct of the government around AIDS emerge? And so I think that in context of this entire situation of a society which is consumed by distrust and hostility and strange kinds of storytelling about poisoning, I think it fits in, although I see it's not specifically about assassination.
No, I think you're right. I think it absolutely does. And I must say, and I'm sure this has been pointed out to you a lot these days, reading back on those crazy times of, you know, Virodine and the general atmosphere that under the Mbeki regime, those dark days, it was really kind of astounding to me how much of that resonates with the current atmosphere around COVID. I mean, including the language used by those advocating against antiretrovirals, to the idea that, you know, to force people to take ARVs was a violation of freedom of choice and the rest of it. And we see that language just so strongly at the moment with regards to the anti-vaccine crew, etc.
Yeah, I think it's demographically, it's probably a different set of the population. I mean, my sense is it's more associated with conservative or right-wing views, COVID denial, but not only. Yes, I mean, and it surprises me where it comes from. I mean, we tell ourselves the story that it was Mbeki's decision only to launch into that denialist campaign in 2000 or so, but it can't have been only him. And if it is only him, we have to think about how do we set up our party structure and our state structure so that one person's strange, you know, ideas can lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths. I mean, there's got to be a way to prevent it, you know?
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. You're right that we tend to imbue the sole figure of Mbeki with all responsibility, and by the same token, actually, the sole figure of Jacob Zuma with all credit for the rollout of antiretrovirals thereafter. I mean, which arguably Jacob Zuma had almost no personal involvement in whatsoever. And of course, we also overlook the involvement of individual MECs for health. Speaking of which, you know, before I forget this, Imraan, I mean, you open the book with this stunning story that I've just been like doing the rounds, telling on your behalf about the former KZN MEC for health, Peggy Mkhonyeni. That's right. Would you do us the honors?
So, okay. Well, I heard about Peggy and Kanyana from my father. My father, I mean, his memory is not so great nowadays. I mean, he's 81, but he had a way of finding some of the most interesting stories and telling them. I think he came from that generation of men who are really wonderful joke tellers and storytellers. And one day he said to me, I was at a dinner to celebrate a new children's hospital, and Peggy and Kanyana, the KZN MEC for Health, was there, and she wanted to have dinner, and her bodyguards or chief of staff came up to me and said, well, where's the taster? And my dad said, what taster? What do you mean? So he said, someone's got to taste the food before the provincial minister MEC can eat it. What if it's poison? So my dad said, I didn't know what to do. I overlooked the hiring of a taster on this occasion. And so the guards think to themselves, and they just go outside, and then they grab 2 street kids and they bring them back in to be the tasters for the food. I mean, I don't think the food was poisoned, so I don't think they were in any danger. But
all's well that ends well. There were no victims, but there could have been.
I guess they could have been.
Yeah. And perhaps that leads us to the more contemporary use of poison in South African society. I mean, the serious aspect there, of course, I mean, other than all the serious aspects, is that Peggy Nkonyeni clearly was in the habit of routinely believing that her food could be poisoned. Now, as you say, poison by its nature is just wrapped up in this absolute haze of rumor and denial, etc. Do we have any sense, allowing for your expert, non-expert position on this, do we have any sense, though, of to what degree is political poisoning a legitimate threat to the body politic in South Africa currently?
I'm a rationalist, so I feel like until we see the dead bodies stacked up, there's probably no threat. Having said that, if you're Peggy and Kanyana, you don't want to be one of the bodies stacked up. And I was a complete skeptic until I mentioned briefly that I had a conversation with Albie Sachs at some point. And I said, Albie Sachs turns out to have been present in 2 different places, it seems inconceivable to me. He was part of that poisoning case where back in the early 80s, where Jacob Zuma claimed, he keeps claiming he has this list, the list of double agents. The person he got this list from may or may not have been poisoned, but Albie was there at the time. Albie was also familiar with Jacob Zuma during his presidency. And I said, Albie, why does Jacob Zuma claim he was poisoned? And Albie said, well, no, he probably was poisoned. It may have been a love potion given to him by his wife, or it seems to have been. And so, look, maybe there are some Zuma family politics. And maybe Zuma did get ill at some point. And, I don't know. I've never given anyone a love potion, although, I mean, it would be a nice option to have, I suppose.
It would be handy to have that in one's armory. We know that the accusations of poisoning against one of Zuma's wives was a pretext. I mean, we know this now because the National Prosecuting Authority, in its kind of most untainted recent incarnation, has said there was no evidence to suggest that Zuma. And yet the wife in question was pushed out of Nkandla.
Interrogated at length, persecuted by the... I mean, it was very Russian in a way,
It was very Russian, and it was a really good example of the way in which poisoning allegations can be used in highly practical political terms. I mean, not so much in a modern democracy, but certainly within the family unit in the way that Jacob Zuma has.
Yeah.
The claims around the Deputy President, David Mabuza, are equally confounding in a way, and perhaps most is his insistence on traveling to Russia. I mean, if I wanted to be poisoned, I'd go to Russia. It just seems so weird to me that Russia is considered like the global antidote for poison.
Well, I guess if you're poisoning people, you also probably invest a certain amount
in antidotes.
Yeah, resources in antidotes. But I think there's a hospital near the Kremlin. I think it's popularly called the Kremlin Clinic. It treats high-up dignitaries. And I mean, my guess is, again, I'm not actually a spy or an expert in espionage, although my sort of uncle, Imraan Coovadia, who died recently, was actually a spy. And so, I feel like maybe I have some expertise. I think that the Kremlin Clinic is probably working with Russian intelligence to tell specifically politicians from Africa what they want to hear, to give them the medical certificates they want, and to say, you know what, David, you can now we have now cured you of your whatever it is, rare earth metal poisoning or thallium poisoning. Here's your certificate. You can go back home. You can give it to Discovery Health, get refunded. And so the Russians seem to have picked up on this kind of story, and they seem to be willing to treat our politicians. God bless them.
And the Cubans, of course, in Cuba.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the Cubans are doing, but they're definitely helping out as a friendly power. They're helping out Zuma in some way.
So Zuma says, as you record in the book, which was helpful because I'd lost track, that I think that he has been poisoned 4 times.
I think it's 3, but I think we're worried that it might happen again. Is it 3 or 4?
3. You're right. And that the culprits have been his wife, as we mentioned. It's been his ANC opponents, including Ramaphosa himself. And it's been the CIA, it's been MI6.
Although I think it was split up. I thought it was Ramaphosa. We're talking about a scene that's related in Gayton Mackenzie's book at an NEC meeting where someone offers Jacob Zuma a piece of liver, and Gayton Mackenzie points out that when you offer a Zulu man a piece of liver, it's a culturally fraught thing, and he has to eat it because it's considered such a delicacy. And it seemed pretty clear to me reading that account, firstly, that it was probably coming from Zuma, and secondly, that Ramaphosa was the person who's being indicated. Yeah. And when Random House sent my manuscript to a lawyer, because I said, you know what, you better send this thing to a lawyer first, the only thing that they objected to was the implication that it was Ramaphosa. And look, from my point of view, obviously Ramaphosa was not trying to poison Zuma. But interestingly, the one thing the Zuma camp has cleared up in retrospect is that was not Ramaphosa trying to poison Zuma, it was Zweli Mkhize trying to poison Zuma.
Right. And of course, he does fit the criminologist's profile of a poisoner. Access
I think Zweli Mkhize is extremely, I think he's a genuinely charming person. Unlike Zuma and I suppose Helen Ziller and Basson, his charm really does work on me. But yes, the Zuma camp now believes that it was Mkhize who was behind that poisoning. I think the theory is, especially in these kinds of debate, these kinds of stories, that it's the person who pretends to be very close to you who's actually poisoning you. I don't think Cyril Ramaphosa was close enough. I think Zweli Mkhize, as a fellow Zulu politician, was the person who was close and distant at the same time.
And yet, of course, it's not solely the Zuma camp that is making these, at least our neighboring country, Zimbabwe. Yeah. We have seen the Mugabes have been sort of surrounded by these poisoning allegations in the same manner. And you make some interesting points about what it means to kind of break bread together, to eat together in a context of poison. It's this very intimate act, which at the same time then becomes kind of just laced with profound danger.
It's very well. Anyone who comes from an Indian family knows that having dinner is a very frightening thing sometimes with your family or your friends. But I think that the overall thing here is that there are things which hold a society together. Eating together is one of the things that really holds a political party, a movement, a society together, a workplace together. And once you start telling stories about how eating together is the most terrifying thing you can do, you can really divide society, drive it apart. And I think, Zuma is the master of those divisions, of making those divisions. And these stories are really important for him in those ways.
That's a great point. He does, as you say, specialize in a certain kind of social divisiveness as it is. And yeah, there's a good question here from Gabriel Mayer. To what extent can claims of poisoning be linked to a belief in witchcraft, love potions, other concoctions with magical properties?
I think it's a very good question, and certainly something I started off thinking. But there are two kind of distinct poisoning practices here. There are kind of the practices of security forces who were really using poisons, and then there are these stories of poisoning. I think there's probably something linked, there are clear linkages between problems of sorcery and problems of poisoning, but I don't think they're reducible to each other. I think the interesting thing is these concerns with poisons are very modern and very in the open and related to issues of science and technology, the development of these weapons and these clinics overseas who offer these cures. I go into this when I look at Mnangagwa's statement to the Financial Mail, where after he was elected, he talks about this issue of him being poisoned. And the language he uses is very interesting. It's like the language of someone who's very impressed by science and technology, but doesn't quite, he uses the language, but he doesn't quite able to incorporate it into his own vocabulary. So I think, I think it's a mutation maybe of the ways in which witchcraft used to work, but it's separate.
And I mean, the other obvious point to be made here is that because we know that poisoning is not a solely Southern African preoccupation, I mean, we have to look no further than the very well publicized poisoning of those Russian agents in Salisbury in the UK in 2018, and numerous other Russian agents. The French were huge on poisoning for a long time too, and these are the kind of modern European societies not normally associated with witchcraft or belief in
absolutely. The Russian one is very interesting because they use poison, but they also make it clearly traceable back to the Kremlin. In other words, the poisons they use, because they're radioactive, you can also follow the path back. So they're not trying to get away with it. They kind of want people to know that this is, that we poisoned you, and here's the radioactive path all the way back to Moscow.
Right, it's a message. Jenny Roos here with an interesting historical point. In 1995, the All Blacks assumed they'd been poisoned just before the final match in the World Cup. That was the reason they lost the game. That is also very true. And another perhaps example of the ways in which poisoning allegations are used for political ends.
I think we won the World Cup in 1995,
yes.
I remember. Yes, and
I
maybe
think
I think the All Blacks did say that they were food poisoned or something, right?
And of course, the distinction between food poisoning and ordinary poisoning is invisible, is it not?
Well, I think food poisoning happens more often by accident.
That's fair.
But the All Blacks the All Blacks should need to be really careful where they eat in future.
You would think actually that if anyone was going to introduce food tasters, it might be sports teams rather than politicians. There was a question here a while back from Rose Sanderson. Imraan, does your book include the chemical warfare funding by the NIAID in the US under Bush's presidency?
It does not. I mean, I have that brief excursion into American politics just because it connected to Rhodesia. But no, I mean, to do work on the Americans it would be a whole different kind of ballgame. And I think the nice thing about Southern Africa is it's quite contained. You can isolate it to, a couple of dozen human beings who've done this. The United States, you're talking about a vast industry, of specialists in all these different fields.
That's right. And, that reminds me of the astonishing little factoid in your book of how the US sent Pretoria consignments of viruses.
I think Ebola and Marburg. Sorry, what?
To what end?
That's a very good question. Why in 1984? I mean, Pretoria was not the most stable ally. Why did they send them Marburg and Ebola and so forth? And it's the CDC who sent them. It seems to me, we now feel the United States is opposed to proliferation, but it was a major proliferator of very serious biological agents. I think, we're very lucky that there wasn't a serious incident of mass murder with any of the weapons that Pretoria had at its disposal, and it had them. So, yeah, I mean, it's very troubling. We're lucky that no atomic bomb was used, and nobody got hold of those stocks of bacteria. But they were being used in crazy ways. I was going to university in the United States in the late 1980s, and to read about the fact that Americans were crossing the Atlantic on the same flights I was on with vials filled with deadly germs is quite shocking. That SAA had these men flying around on it.
Do we know what happened to those stocks of bacterial weaponry that Pretoria was building? Just out of interest.
We don't. I think. I don't anyway. I mean, I assume, in any other country, you'd say, I assume they were disposed of responsibly. But even that's not true. The particular man I'm talking about, the guy who lived in, I think it was LA and brought all these things over to Pretoria. When he died, he killed himself because, he was under investigation for assassinating his business partner, right? And when he killed himself and they searched his home, they found his fridge filled with these, deadly viruses and bacteria. So, the other thing is that these things proliferate in ways we just can't imagine. Someone who has the knowledge will take them home and put them in their freezer.
We've all got to have a hobby, Imraan, especially in these difficult times. The AJ Kruger says, could the hesitancy around COVID vaccination be seen as part of this collective fear of poisoning?
Certainly. I mean, I think poison is it reaches right into our body, right? It's terrifying to have something in your body that can hurt you. And I think, yes, COVID fears are being triggered by it, but also by the fact that science and technology have been misused in the past, that the reassurances we have from scientists on many issues have turned out not to be true, or governments have misused science. I completely opposed to COVID hesitancy and so forth, but I was talking about this, I think, to Bongani Kona, and it occurred to me that, I don't know if you remember when the CIA thought they'd seen a very large turbaned man in a city in Pakistan, and they thought, well, maybe that's Osama bin Laden. I mean, how many tall turban guys are there? I mean, actually, maybe there are a lot in Pakistan. Anyway, they sent some people to the door of that compound before they killed him. And those people said, if I remember correctly, I should have looked it up, that they were vaccinating children, and so I wonder if that those kinds of misuses of vaccination have led to vaccine hesitancy. But look, I think the more important thing is science really needs to be trustworthy. And so scientists also have to take a part in regulating themselves, discussing the failures of science, discussing in South Africa the kinds of things that science and technology were complicit with, engineers were complicit with. And I don't think we've had those discussions. The US has gone much further than us in reconstructing some of the terrible things that we've done. I mean, the smallpox experiments done on black men, syphilis experiments, and other things. But we really have very little information.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the HPCSA did hold hearings, I think, on Wouter Basson, but I think, as far as I remember, it ended in him being able to keep his medical license, did it not?
Yes.
I can't quite recall. I think he is still a practicing cardiologist, as far as I know.
Yes, no, in fact, well, I don't want to out anybody who's listened to this podcast, but one of my wonderful students told me that his father had a heart complaint or heart murmur driving down to Cape Town, and he woke up under the care of Dr. Basson, and he said his heart got worse.
I can totally imagine. I cannot believe those people who seem so happy to put themselves under doctor. I mean, we mustn't get into this, Imraan. We're both going to get into big trouble. Luandle has a question. What happened to that vast infrastructure of scientists who worked on the South African biological weapons program, other than Basson, I assume, we've just covered? Did we export them like we did with nuclear experts from the SSSR?
We definitely exported some of them. Some of them tried to export themselves. One of the cases I go into in the book is somebody who, I think he was high up in Project Coast, and then he ended up working on a chicken farm. And so he wrote to the FBI and he said, I have all these interesting viruses and stuff. Can we meet? Can you give me American citizenship? So he tried to export himself. In fact, I think the FBI decided he really didn't have any up-to-date viruses, so they didn't give him citizenship. But some tried to export themselves. We know quite little about what happened to all that infrastructure, I think. Between 1991 and 1998, everything just kind of melted away. And so
absolutely. Yeah, all those records, etc. Imraan, while I have you pinned down, I'm definitely going to force you to answer two questions which I had hanging over my head after reading your book. The first was your observation that the majority of these political poisoning rumors in South Africa are linked to the political faction known as the RET faction, the Radical Economic Transformation. What does that mean, in your view?
That's a good question. If I knew exactly what it meant 2 years ago, I should have put in the manuscript. I think, thinking about it now, I think that they are held together by a kind of corrupted form of storytelling, a kind of storytelling which works in situations of extreme distrust, where we all distrust each other, we're hostile to each other, we're hostile to science, reason, journalists, data. And I think they hold themselves together through stories like that. In particular, strangely, that story, but obviously other kinds of corrupted storytelling. So I think that's what's going on from a kind of ethnic or anthropological point of view. I think there are a few other cases where people may or may not have been poisoned. People have suggested to me that Fawzia Peer, who is the deputy mayor of Durban, had glass filled with paraffin. I think that might be true. But I think there are probably a scattered number of cases. But clearly the RET faction is being held together by the sense of elemental evil directed at them. And that elemental evil is the poisoner's evil.
That's right. And there's a kind of victimhood that goes with that. I do think it's also possible that if the likes of Mr. Ramaphosa were to believe they had been poisoned, they would potentially not take it to the public, because I think there is also an interesting divide here between the politician who perhaps prides himself on being a kind of sophisticated, worldly statesman, and those appealing to a kind of rural traditionalist base who might be more kind of, I don't know, more fearful of the same kind of poisoning. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I think it would be strange. I think it would certainly be strange if Cyril Ramaphosa came out and said, Jacob Zuma has poisoned us. It would worry me that someone high up in our state would say that. On the other hand, have you read Justice Mukhung's latest sermon about, what is it, fire, brimstone, and whatever it is? People have very strange beliefs. I mean, Imelda Marcos or Nancy Reagan, people say very strange things and have very unexpected things going on in their heads.
That's also true. Finally, Imraan, you think that COVID-19 may have brought an end to the poisoning panic?
Yeah, I think I was being optimistic when I wrote that.
Well, it makes so much sense to me, right? Because for a start, there's all this kind of health pantomime and theatrics around, distancing, and it's now unthinkable for us to share food and drink and cigarettes in the way that we used to before, right?
Yes. No, I mean, you might be right. It was kind of an intuition that it seems a bit ridiculous to worry about it now that we have really big health problems. I think there's something else too, that COVID-19 has seen us accept the power of the state in certain ways, and maybe that is contradictory to these kind of rumors of poisoning to running our political life the way. But I can't prove it. I just have a sense that those stories about poisoning have much less traction now and much less relevance than they did even a year ago.
I think that's absolutely right. Imraan Coovadia, thank you so much. His book is The Poisoners on South Africa's Toxic Past. It is a really, truly fascinating read, despite his protestations that he is not a spy or an expert or a poisoner himself. I think his expertise tells a different story. Thank you so much, Imraan, and thank you very much to all those who've joined us. Please do buy Imraan's book on the Daily Maverick website or wherever else you choose to, and have a wonderful Thursday further. Thanks, Imraan.
It's great. Thank you.